It is just after midnight on August 5th, 1962. The lights are on inside a quiet Brentwood house. The phone keeps ringing. No one is answering. Inside the bedroom, Marilyn Monroe lies alone on the bed. She's naked. A phone receiver is nearby. Prescription bottles set within reach. There's no struggle, no overturned furniture, no dramatic chaos, just stillness. By the time the police arrive, the story is already forming. Within hours, the headlines are locked in. Movie star found dead. By morning, the language hardens. Probable suicide. By the next day, the narrative is complete. America wakes up stunned, but not confused, because Hollywood gives people a version they already know how to process. The press doesn't ask how a woman surrounded by doctors ended up alone with overlapping prescriptions. They don't linger on medication, isolation, or responsibility. They don't interrogate that system. They grieve her beauty, they mourn how fragile she was, and they call it tragic. Newspapers describe her as troubled, unstable, fragile beneath the glamour. Radio commentators speak softly as if volume might invite questions. Fans leave flowers and cry for the girl that they thought they knew. Hollywood closes ranks. What the public is given is a clean ending. A woman overwhelmed by fame, a star who couldn't survive herself. It's a story that comforts everyone still alive. Because if Marilyn Monroe died at her own hand, then no one failed her. No doctor, no studio, no system. And once that story is accepted, there's no need to look closer. This episode starts at her death because that's where the lie settles in. Not with a bang, but with a quiet agreement that this version is enough. I'm here to say it is not. I'm Becca, and this is Hollywood is Dead from Deadly Truths. Before the myth, before the dress, before the punchlines and the tragedy packaging, there was a woman who was far more deliberate, intelligent, and self-aware than Hollywood ever wanted to admit. Marilyn Monroe was not a happy accident. She did not wander into fame. She built herself piece by piece out of a childhood defined by instability and a system that underestimated her at every turn. Her real name was Norma Jean. She grew up without a reliable parent, without permanence, and without protection. What that creates is not weakness, it creates adaptation. She learned to read rooms. She learned what people want before they say it. You learn how to survive systems that don't care if you do. Hollywood later rewrote that childhood as proof she was broken. This was convenient, because if she was already damaged, then no one else had to take responsibility for what came later. But here's the part that gets erased. She read constantly, not tabloids, not fluff. She read literature, psychology, philosophy, acting theory. She annotated books. She studied people. She paid attention. She understood motivation and subtext, things the studio preferred their blonde icon not to notice. She trained seriously as an actress. She did not rely on charm. She left Hollywood and put herself in rooms where the work mattered, where the goal was truth, not obedience. And she was good, dangerously good. Look at Niagara, for instance. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but if you like classic movies, you need to watch it. It'll change your perspective on Marilyn. That is not ditzy. That's restraint and menace. Look at Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Diamonds are a girl's best friend. This is one of her more famous songs. Most people who are familiar with Marilyn will know this one. This is not stupidity, it's satire. She's playing a woman playing a stereotype, and she's in control of the joke the entire time. Again, if you have not seen that actual movie, you need to watch it. Then there's How to Marry a Millionaire. Surgical comic timing. Again, classic. The 7-Year Itch, innocent performed with intention. This again, complete classic. I could go on and on about the movies that Marilyn did because unlike some other actresses from her time, this woman had legs, and I don't mean just the literal ones. And then, of course, you've got Some Like It Hot, one of the greatest comedic performances ever put on film, still today. Absolutely hilarious. Comedy is harder than drama. Marilyn knew that, and she mastered it. She also did something almost unforgivable in the 1950s world of Hollywood. She founded her own production company. That wasn't ambition, it was defiance. A woman who questions scripts, asks why her characters have no interior life, and demands better writing stops being decorative. And Hollywood does not like women who stop being decorative. So the story changed. When she prepared carefully, she was unreliable. When she questioned authority, she was difficult. When she wanted autonomy, she was called unstable. Those weren't observations, they were disciplinary labels. Hollywood needed her to be naive, because a smart woman in a sexualized body is a problem. Intelligence spreads, agency spreads, and Marilyn was learning too much too fast. The version of Marilyn most people remember, the dumb blonde, the fragile starlet, the woman who couldn't handle fame, that version is not real. It's containment. Because if audiences had seen her clearly as a sharp, ambitious, self-aware woman navigating power, then the system around her would have been exposed much earlier. And Hollywood has always been better at selling a lie than surviving the truth. That's who Marilyn Monroe really was. Not a cautionary tale, a threat. And that's why the myth had to be louder than the woman. Here's the moment the relationship broke. Not when she was late to set, not when she struggled with sleep, not when the headlines started whispering difficult. It broke when Marilyn Monroe stopped being compliant. Hollywood can tolerate chaos, it cannot tolerate defiance. As long as Marilyn showed up smiling, hit the marks, and played the blonde exactly as written, the machine protected her. But the second she started asking why the script was thin, why her character had no inner life, that was something she actually asked, why men with worse behavior were being indulged, the tone changed. Studios don't want to argue with women like Marilyn. When she wanted more control over her roles, she wasn't called ambitious, she was called unstable. When she took acting seriously, trained seriously, and slowed down to do the work right, that wasn't professionalism, it was called unreliable. When she formed her own production company, that wasn't entrepreneurship, it was ignorance. Those labels weren't descriptive, they were punitive. This is how the industry disciplines women who step out of line. It reframes resistance as illness. Male co-stars, they could drink, disappear, scream at crew members, blow schedules, assault women, and still be called temperamental, brilliant, or a tortured genius. Marilyn Monroe showed up with anxiety or insisted on better conditions, and suddenly she was a liability, a problem, a risk. And once the label sticks, everything else follows. Doctors stop answering to the patient. They start answering to the studio. Medication becomes management, not healing, scheduling. Sleep when told, wake when told, perform when told, smile when told. If her body resisted, the dosage went up. If her mind resisted, the blame shifted to her psychology, not the environment poisoning her. Isolation followed. Access was filtered. Friends were rotated out. Information was controlled. The goal was not care, it was compliance. And here is the part Hollywood never wants to examine. If Marilyn had been truly incompetent, truly unstable, truly incapable, she would have been discarded quietly. Instead, she was managed aggressively. Let's face it, anytime starlet, so to speak, was actually incompetent, unstable, and truly incapable, Hollywood has never had an issue kicking that person to the curb. But they kept Marilyn around. What does that tell you? Because she still had power, cultural power, sexual power, box office power, and power in a woman who is not obedient is dangerous. So the industry did what it always does when a woman refuses the script. It rewrote her behavior as pathology, it reframed her intelligence as instability, and it turned resistance into diagnosis. By the time she died, the public had already been trained to accept one conclusion, that whatever happened, it was her fault. That did not happen overnight. It was built, decision by decision, label by label, prescription by prescription. And once that narrative was set, the ending didn't need to be questioned. So now let's talk about how medication replaced care and why that made tragedy not possible but predictable. This is where the system stopped pretending. By the late 1950s, Marilyn Monroe wasn't being cared for, she was being managed, right? And Hollywood likes to talk about her mental health struggles as if they existed in a vacuum. They did not. What she was experiencing was the predictable result of an industry that refused to slow down and chose chemistry instead. Barbiturates and amphetamines weren't treatment. They were scheduling tools. You can see this too with someone like Elvis Presley. When Marilyn couldn't sleep after long shoots, constant scrutiny, and pressure that never shut off, the answer was not rest, it was pills, heavy sedatives to knock her out, regardless of whether her nervous system was ready. Natural sleep was overridden. And then when she couldn't wake up the next morning because sedatives don't magically disappear, she was given stimulants, amphetamines to force alertness, suppress appetite, sharpen focus, and get her on the set looking alive. Down then up, night after night, set after set. This was not accidental. It aligned perfectly with production needs. Sleep when told, wake when told, perform on command, smile on cue. When her body started to resist, when tolerance built up, when anxiety spiked, when memory slipped, the response was not to stop the medication cycle. The response was more medication, different doctors, overlapping prescriptions, no single person responsible. And that matters because once multiple physicians are involved, accountability dissolves. Everyone can say, that wasn't my prescription. And while they passed the responsibility around, Marilyn was left trying to manage a chemically dysregulated body that no longer knew how to function on its own. This is the part people misread as a weakness. What they call instability was actually withdrawal, rebound anxiety, and exhaustion. Predictable physiological responses that anyone would experience under that regimen. But Hollywood reframed those symptoms as proof that she was the problem, not the environment breaking her down. Medication replaced boundaries, pills replaced rest, sedation replaced consent. And once that line is crossed, the end is no longer mysterious. By the time Marilyn died, sleep without drugs was nearly impossible. Waking without stimulants was nearly impossible. Judgment was impaired, not because she was reckless, but because her nervous system had been pushed past regulation for years. This was not a single bad night. It was a long-term pharmaceutical mismanagement dressed up as care. Hollywood did not misunderstand what was happening to her. It understood and decided keeping her functional mattered more than keeping her well. And when that system finally stepped back, it left a woman whose body had been trained to survive only through chemistry. But that's not all, folks. There's also isolation and why that made this ending inevitable. By the time Marilyn Monroe was unraveling publicly, she was already alone privately, and this was not accidental. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just struggling, she was isolated systematically and deliberately by the same structures claiming to protect her. Hollywood learned something early. You don't need to silence a woman outright if you can control her access to other people. Handlers filtered who she could see. Calls were screened. Visits were discouraged. Friends who asked too many questions were labeled bad influences. Isolation was framed as stability. Doctors did not operate independently. They existed inside a studio ecosystem where keeping Marilyn functional mattered more than advocating for her long-term health. When treatment decisions are shaped by production schedules and contracts, medicine stops being neutral. And once she was labeled unstable, her credibility vanished. Anyone who raised concerns could be dismissed as emotional, opportunistic, or disruptive. Anyone who pushed for real intervention was quietly edged out. What remained was a shrinking circle of people whose livelihoods depended on Marilyn continuing to perform, not on her being okay. That's not care, that's containment. Isolation works because it creates dependence. When a person has no consistent advocate, no single doctor in charge, no peer reality check, they start to doubt their own instincts. Marilyn began relying on the very people managing her decline because there was no one else to lean on. And here's the cruel feedback loop. The more isolated she became, the more unstable she appeared, and then therefore, more control was justified. It's a closed system. Isolation creates symptoms. Symptoms justify more isolation. By the time she died, Marilyn was surrounded by professionals, but starved of protection. Monitored, but not supported. Managed, but not defended. Hollywood didn't abandon her at the end. It made sure she was alone long before the end came. And once a person is isolated enough, even catastrophic outcomes can be written off as inevitable. I'm not going to name names here because I don't need to. The record itself shows what happened. What matters isn't personalities, it's a process. And the process is visible if you know what to look for. One of the clearest red flags is this: Marilyn did not have one primary physician with full oversight. Instead, prescriptions came from multiple doctors, medications overlapped in class and in effect. No consolidated treatment plan existed. That's not speculation. It's reflected in prescription records. In modern medicine, this is recognized as a classic setup for harm. Even in the 1950s, it violated emerging standards of care. The absence of a single medical decision maker is proof of removal, not care. In the years leading up to her death, visitors were increasingly limited, spontaneous social contact was declined, and communication routes narrowed. This isn't gossip, it's visible in correspondence gaps, witness timelines, and the sudden absence of previously regular contacts. Isolation was not sudden, it was step by step. That's how systems do it, quietly, plausibly, and always for her own good. As her circle narrowed, one thing increased: paid presence. She had handlers, staff, and medical professionals, people who were contractually tied to her availability. To make it clearer, the people that were around her were people who were given money to keep her functional. And then there's the absence of escalation despite visible risk. And again, it's documented. This is the most damning proof. She had repeated hospitalizations, known sleep disruption, escalating medication use, and clear functional impairment. Yet, there was no involuntary hold, no consolidated intervention, no enforced rest period, no suspension of access to prescriptions. In any other context, this would have triggered escalation. Here, it triggered containment. That's not oversight failure. That's institutional choice. The toxicology report is not complete. And why does it matter? We don't need a villain for this story. What we have is a system where authority fragmented, responsibility evaporated, and outcomes, well, they're reframed as inevitability. Marilyn Monroe wasn't abandoned in one moment. What she was left vulnerable on a regular basis. And when protection disappears slowly enough, the ending looks natural even when it isn't. There will always be a lot of people who say, well, Marilyn Monroe, she isolated herself. She drugged herself. But I think it's important to understand that Marilyn Monroe did not wake up one day and decide to slowly dismantle her own life. But she also was not passive. She was not an unconscious victim. Both things are true at the same time, and that's the part Hollywood narratives avoid. Did she take the drugs herself? Yes, but not independently. She did not invent that regimen. She did not source the drugs by buying them illegally. She did not design that cycle she was on. She followed medical instruction in an era with lax prescribing standards, little understanding of dependency, no prescription monitoring, extreme power imbalance between patients and providers. Barbiturates and amphetamines were doctor-provided, normalized, and reinforced. Once tolerance and rebound set in, that autonomy, it shrinks. That's not moral failure on Monroe's part. It's just the way that cookie crumbles. So yes, she ingested the drugs. No, she was not the architect of the system that kept escalating them. The other question comes up about, did she actually isolate herself? Partially, but I think the context matters. People under chronic pressure often withdraw. That's just being human. But her isolation wasn't just emotional, it was structural. And here's the key distinction. Emotional withdrawal, it's internal. Access restriction, that's coming from external, right? That doesn't happen by accident. Isolation that looks like choice often emerges when people are labeled unstable, others are discouraged from contact, and then the concern is reframed as disruption. At that point, withdrawal becomes adaptive, not pathological. So what or who actually shaped the outcome? No one person. But we can definitely look at the medical providers. I mean, they prescribed overlapping sedatives and stimulants, and they failed to consolidate care. They continued treatment despite the escalating risks. That's not malicious, but it is a professional responsibility. And then you have the industry handlers. They managed the access to her. They prioritized availability over recovery, and they discouraged any disruption to her work schedule. Again, they're not villains, but they were decision makers. And then you gotta look at the institutions, right? They normalized over-medication, they rewarded compliance, they punished disruption, and they avoided post-death accountability. Now, institutions don't feel guilt. They respond to incentives. Yes, Marilyn participated in a system that was harming her because resisting it threatened her livelihood. Saying no carried some consequences, real ones, and alternatives were systematically removed. That's not consent in a meaningful sense. Agency without viable alternatives is constrained. There are tons of conspiracies out there about Marilyn Monroe's death, but it was not a secret assassination plot. There was no single mastermind, and there was no woman gleefully self-destructing. But it also was not an accident. It was not suicide. It was not just victimhood. Marilyn Monroe died at the intersection of dependence, managed isolation, institutional convenience, and constrained personal choice. No one had to kill her. The system only had to keep doing what it was already doing and step back when the consequences arrived. That's why the story still matters, because this model didn't end in 1962, it just learned how to look cleaner. To understand Marilyn Monroe, you have to look at the two men she married after fame, because they reveal what she was searching for and what the world kept denying her. Marilyn Monroe didn't marry for publicity, she married for safety and legitimacy, and neither marriage could survive the system around her. There was Joe DiMaggio. He offered protection, but without understanding. DiMaggio was deeply uncomfortable with her public sexuality, not because he didn't know what she did for a living, but because the scale of it humiliated him. The famous subway grate moment wasn't just a fight about a scene. It was a collision between two worlds, a man who believed love meant withdrawal and a woman whose survival depended on visibility. Joe wanted to shield her from Hollywood. Hollywood had already wired her nervous system to survive inside of it. They lasted only 9 months. But even after the divorce, Joe remained the most consistently protective presence in her life. He never exploited her image. He never sold her pain. Joe didn't understand Marilyn, but he believed she deserved protection, and he believed the system failed. Then there's Arthur Miller. He's basically legitimacy without protection. He was a writer. Miller offered Marilyn something Joe could not: intellectual validation. With Miller, she was not a sex symbol. She was a mind, a woman who read, questioned, and wanted to be taken seriously. For someone who had spent her life being underestimated, that mattered more than romance. But intellectual recognition is not the same as emotional safety. Miller did not have an issue with her fame. Where Joe wanted to hide her body, Miller wanted to outgrow it. He believed she could transcend the blonde image if she just worked harder, suffered quieter, and proved herself worthy of seriousness. Now again, that's not partnership, that's a project. Marilyn sensed his disappointment. In her anxiety, her dependence, her need for reassurance, his writings increasingly reflected that tension. Instead of defending her against the industry, he absorbed its judgment. She needed someone who would stand between her and the machine. Miller stood slightly aside and then analyzed the damage. Their marriage collapsed under the weight of unmet expectations and her worsening health. By then, the medication cycle was entrenched and isolation was accelerating. What do those two marriages actually show? Joe DiMaggio offered loyalty, protection, stability, but he didn't understand her need for autonomy. And then Arthur Miller offered respect for her intelligence, legitimacy, and seriousness, but did not protect her when it mattered. One wanted to remove her from the fire, the other wanted her to prove she could survive it. Marilyn wasn't choosing the wrong men, she was trying over and over to solve an unsolvable problem: how to be loved as a whole person in a system that only valued her in pieces. Her marriages weren't failures of judgment. They were evidence that no private relationship could counter a public machine determined to keep her profitable. By the time both marriages ended, the system was what it needed: a woman increasingly isolated, increasingly medicated, and publicly framed as a problem, not because she was unlovable, but because love alone was never going to be enough to save her. Joe DiMaggio wasn't equipped to analyze Marilyn. He didn't theorize her pain. What he did was act. He wanted her out of the machine, out of the sexualized gaze, out of that chaos. He believed love meant shielding, even if he did not fully understand what she needed to survive emotionally. When the marriage failed, her story to protect himself. After her death, the funeral he had was private, and that was deliberate. He did not give a press conference. He went silent. And for 20 years, he sent roses to her crypt. No interviews, no branding, no reinterpretation. And that is not nostalgia. That's grief that refuses to cooperate with the narrative. Joe DiMaggio never blamed Marilyn. He blamed what surrounded her. But Arthur Miller, he gave Marilyn something that she craved, right? Legitimacy. And he took her intelligence seriously. And he treated her as a mind, not a spectacle. But when the system closed in, Miller did not stand between her and it. He actually absorbed Hollywood's framing. He turned lived experiences into a metaphor. And after her death, he did not challenge the suicide narrative. He did not question the medical chaos. He did not indict the industry. Instead, he processed Marilyn through art, reshaping her into a figure defined by emotional need, being fragile and dependent. And it is definitely significant because that version stuck. Miller did not attack her, but he definitely did not defend her either. When you put these two men side by side, Joe DiMaggio responded with exclusion and loyalty, and Miller responded with distance and interpretation. One said, "They don't get to have her anymore," and the other said this is how it all made sense. One protected her body and her memory, and the other protected the story that blamed her mind. And I think what's very interesting, Hollywood prefers the Miller version. Articulate, tragic, internal, and contained, because it's safer. DiMaggio's response points outwards, right? It asks really uncomfortable questions, and it suggests failure beyond the individual. And that's why it's easier to romanticize Marilyn than it is to set with what Joe DiMaggio's silence actually says. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just her. Let's slow this down and take it piece by piece, because this is how the myth replaces evidence if you let it. We have to address the elephant in the room, John F. Kennedy. Marilyn Monroe did have a relationship with Kennedy. We know this not because of gossip columns or conspiracy books, but because of consistent overlapping accounts from people who were present in social circles that later corroborated by historians and biographers. There is no single gotcha document. Instead, there's basically a convergence, matching timelines, private meetings arranged through other people, security-related logistics that don't make sense for a casual acquaintance, and post-event confirmations from insiders who had no incentive to invent the story. So this is how most elite affairs are documented, indirectly, quietly, and in retrospect. The consensus among serious historians is that the relationship was real, it was brief and personal, definitely not political. What it was not was ongoing, controlling, or central to Marilyn's life by the time that she died. The relationship appears to have ended before 1962, and it ended the way a powerful man's affair often ends, especially in that era. Not with confrontation, but with just distance. Marilyn did not gain leverage from this affair. She did not gain protection, and she certainly did not gain power. And that brings us to the birthday performance, the Happy Birthday, Mr. President. And I know, I probably just totally butchered that, but she did it way more sexy, right? That moment did not happen spontaneously. It was orchestrated by event planners who understood spectacle and publicity. Marilyn was invited to appear at Madison Square Gardens in May of 1962, a high-profile Democratic fundraiser celebrating Kennedy's birthday. Her late entrance, the skin-tight dress, the breathy delivery, all of it was calculated to land as playful glamour. What no one accounted for was how it would land politically. The performance crossed a line because it took something meant to be private and made it public, not explicit, but unmistakable. For a presidency built on image, discipline, family, optics, and controlled messaging, that moment was a problem. And powerful institutions don't respond to problems with drama, not back then anyways. They respond with containment. After the performance, Marilyn was quietly distanced from the Kennedy orbit, not confronted, not threatened, just removed. You gotta remember, this was the 1960s, and back then, politics was considerably more guarded. Calls stopped being returned, invitations stopped coming, and any connections she had disappeared. The message was implicit and unmistakable. This connection is over. And this matters because it's often misread as motive. But distancing is not silence, it's risk management. There is no evidence that Marilyn attempted blackmail, no evidence she threatened exposure, no evidence she possessed political secrets. These claims appear only after her death, when people went looking for a larger-than-life explanation. And here's the reality check. If Marilyn had been a political liability in any meaningful sense, the response would not have been isolation and silence. It would have been legal containment, non-disclosure enforcement, standard tools of power that were used. Instead, she was simply excluded. That exclusion hurt her emotionally. It reinforced her sense of disposability. It compounded isolation that was already growing because of medication dependence and industry withdrawal, but it did not kill her. The Kennedys did not control her prescriptions. They did not manage her medical care. They did not oversee her daily life. And they were definitely not present in her final moments. Blaming them for her death doesn't expose power, it just misdirects it. Because the real failure was not political. It was medical and institutional, and conspiracy thinking lets those systems off the hook by replacing negligence with fantasy. The truth is smaller, sadder, and it's harder to make into a myth. Marilyn Monroe didn't die because she knew too much. She died after being over medicated, isolated, and left without meaningful protection while everyone else moved on. And believing anything else makes the story more dramatic, but less honest. When you strip away mythology, scandal, and wishful thinking, the question isn't who killed Marilyn Monroe, it's what kind of death this actually was. Marilyn Monroe died with lethal levels of barbiturates in her system. That fact is not disputed. What's disputed is intent, and intent is where people rush to simple answers that don't hold up. So let's take the three options one by one. You got suicide. This was the official conclusion, probable suicide. And here is what supports it. She had prior depressive episodes. She had expressed distress in the past. She was alone and she ingested fatal amounts of medication. Here is what weakens probable suicide. There is no clear behavior that night that points to suicide or, thoughts of suicide. There's no evidence of a planned goodbye. She had made future plans, professional and personal, before her death. She was also under the influence of medications known to impair your judgment. Suicide requires intentional, organized decision making. Sedatives do not clarify the mind, they confuse it. Calling this suicide assumes clarity where the chemistry says there was not clarity. Then, of course, we've got murder. And this is where the conspiracy theories take over, right? But there's no evidence of forced entry. There's no evidence of a physical struggle. There's no credible forensic proof of poisoning by another party. There's no verified threats. There's no documentation of political or financial motives strong enough to justify murder. The murder theory survives because it's dramatic, not because it's supported. That makes it emotionally satisfying, but analytically, it's useless. The most accurate category would just be negligence. This is the answer that most people resist because it doesn't give you this clean ending that a lot of us want, but it fits the evidence best. Marilyn was prescribed overlapping sedatives, treated by multiple doctors without unified oversight. She was dependent, isolated from consistent advocacy, and left alone with medications that were dangerous even by the standards of that time. Negligence doesn't require intent, it requires foreseeability. And the risk here was foreseeable. Anyone with basic medical training knew tolerance increases, rebound insomnia worsens, judgment deteriorates, overdose risk escalates rapidly. Yet the system continued. So what most likely happened? The most evidence-based conclusion is this. Marilyn did not set out to die that night. She also was not protected from the risk of dying. She likely took medication to sleep as she had been conditioned to do, without full awareness of the dosage compounding, right? Then there were the interactions and the danger. That's not suicide in the moral sense, and it's not murder. Labeling her death as suicide solved a lot of problems for Hollywood. It ended scrutiny, absolved institutions, avoided medical accountability, protected reputations, and it closed the file. Marilyn Monroe did not die because she was weak. She did not die because she knew too much. She didn't die because she was doomed. She died because care became, accountability disappeared, and everyone accepted the easiest story because negligence is boring. Negligence is common. Negligence is survivable until it is not. And that's why this case still matters, because Marilyn Monroe wasn't the last person destroyed by a system that found it easier to label a death than to examine itself. She was just the most famous. Before we leave Marilyn Monroe in the place Hollywood prefers, which is as a tragedy, we need to put her back where she actually belongs. Because Marilyn Monroe was not just beautiful, she was valuable, culturally and financially, and that part never stopped. At the height of her career in the 1950s, Marilyn was one of the highest paid women in Hollywood. Not the highest, because studios made sure of that. Adjusted for inflation, her peak earnings would translate to roughly 10 to 15 million per year today, and that's being conservative. That doesn't count the indirect money. The film she anchored, the marketing campaign she carried, the studio leverage she created just by attaching her name. Movies like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, The 7-Year Itch, and Some Like It Hot, they were not just hits, they were cornerstones of studio profit. She was not interchangeable. When Marilyn was in a film, audiences showed up. When she was not, the studios felt it. And here's the part that should still make people feel a tad unsteady. She was underpaid by design, made tens of millions off her work in 1950s dollars, which would be hundreds of millions today. So the studios were making considerably more off of her than she was making per year, if you get my meaning. And they were tightly controlling her contracts, her image rights, and residuals. She generated wealth as a scale she was never allowed to fully access. That's frickin' awful. That imbalance didn't end when she died either. Which is even more awful. Today, Marilyn Monroe's image generates an estimated 8 to 12 million annually, depending on licensing cycles, advertising, fashion, beauty brands, art, merchandising. Her face still sells. 60 years later, a media landscape drowning in content, Marilyn Monroe still sells. She doesn't get a say. Hey, she's dead. The rights to her estate passed through corporate hands and now sit with entities that never knew her, never protected her, and never paid the price for what happened. The system that failed her continues to profit from freezing her at the peak of her desirability. She never aged. There didn't have to be a reinvention. There was no inconvenient complexity. She became a perpetual product. But here is what tends to get lost when people talk numbers. Marilyn was joyful. She was funny. She was warm. People who knew her consistently described her in that manner. They also said she was generous, curious, playful, and deeply empathetic. She loved animals. She loved children. She loved books. She laughed easily. She worked hard. She wanted to be better, not more famous, just better. She was not chaos. She was not empty. She was not a punchline. She was a woman who understood the camera so well that it still hasn't caught up. She collaborated with the lens. She knew angles, stillness, timing, and how attention moves. That's why a single image of her still competes with modern celebrities producing content non-stop. Presence like that does not age. So how should Marilyn Monroe be remembered? Not as a dumb blonde, not as a fragile star, not as a conspiracy. She should be remembered as a serious artist trapped in a shallow system, a worker who generated immense wealth without protection, a human being whose life mattered beyond that image. Marilyn Monroe was not a warning about fame. She was a warning about what happens when systems value profit over people and how long they'll keep cashing the checks after the person is long dead. She deserves some rest. She deserves some safety. And she deserves some credit. And now she deserves to be remembered not for how she died, but for how much she gave, how much she created, and how much the world is still taking from her. Because the past is not dead, it's still making money. If you stayed to the end, you're the reason this show exists. This was not an easy story. It wasn't meant to be. And if it made you uneasy, if it made you rethink what you were taught about Marilyn Monroe and about Hollywood itself, then it did its job. If you value stories that don't sanitize power, that don't blame the victim, and that don't stop where it's convenient, please follow Deadly Truths with Becca wherever you listen, subscribe, and definitely rate. Please rate. Share it with someone who still thinks this was just a tragic star story. To the listeners who come back week after week, the ones who finish my episodes, who sit with the nuance, who care more about truth than nostalgia, I am always very thankful for you. You're not here for myths. You're here to understand how systems actually work. This show is for you.